So Yamagara Mai, Nurabati Gomeroi Dangari, Nati John Captain Webb. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us at home. My name is Jonathan Captain Webb. I'm a Gomeroi and Dangari man from the inner city suburb Aboriginal community of Redfern, UNSW alumni. And today we'll be hosting a conversation with Vickie Roach. So I'll hand over now to Auntie Vickie to give a bit of an intro to herself.
Hello, Jonathan. My name's Vickie Roach. I'm a UN woman. I'm currently living on UN country down the south coast of New South Wales. I'm a prison advocate and activist, and I'm also a woman with lived experience who's been inside the prison system. Excellent.
So before we start today, I'll start by acknowledging country. It's with amazing humility and respect that I acknowledge the land on which we meet today. I acknowledge the land of my ancestors. I acknowledge your ancestors. I acknowledge the lands of everyone joining us online today. It's with amazing humility and respect that I pay respect to those elders who have kept country and kept stories, so we might one day walk in their footsteps. Thank you. So, starting off our conversation with Auntie Vickie today, when and how did you first realise that First Nations people across Australia are systematically over-brutalised, over-incarcerated and over-criminalised within our criminal justice system? And how did you react to seeing this?
Well, I'd have to say I was very young at the time, and it started when I was in kids' homes, and there seemed to be a lot more Aboriginal people there than I'd ever seen before, having grown up in a white foster family. And then when I got to prison, and at that time in the early 70s, there were only about 60 women in the New South Wales system then, and they were all in Malawa, for as far as I knew, at Silverwater. And of those 60 women, I reckon half of them were Aboriginal women. And the worst thing was that they were from so far away. They were from country towns that, you know, existed in my imagination. Yet they were all sent to Malawa in Sydney. They were treated badly by the screws. They were treated badly by the police. And in fact, a girl who I was in custody with that first time, and we were both underage. We weren't 18 yet. She was an Aboriginal girl from Redfern. She got out before me, and we arranged to meet when I got out. And when I went to meet her at the spot we'd arranged, a friend of hers or a friend of ours was there and told me that she'd been killed by the police. They literally picked her up, taken her to the cells in Central, give her a hiding, as they often did. She was pretty cheeky. And they broke her neck and she died. So that was a real eye-opener for me. I'd seen people get killed in the cross over drugs and killed by the police in that way, but this was just a total disregard for her humanity, for her youth, for who she was, and her life appeared to mean nothing. So that had a huge impact on me at 17, well 18 by the time I got out.
How do you think the institutionalisation that resulted from the stolen generations and sort of the past traumas accumulates in the criminalisation and brutalisation of First Nation Australians? And how is this, felt by the next generation of Aboriginal people?
Well, it all started with colonisation. We were criminalised and herded up and rounded up and placed in special places, even just being rounded up and shot, massacred. That criminalisation of us as a race of people began then and has been unrelenting since. Just the methods have changed, the ways of criminalising us. They create the very conditions that feed us into their system, like through stolen generations, removing us from family, from country, that type of thing. And of course, institutionalising children, locking up children it's a direct feed straight into the criminal justice system as an adult.
In contemporary times, we're starting to understand the role of intergenerational trauma and the impact that has on First Nations families and communities. How do you see that intergenerational oppression resulting from the continuous and ongoing impacts of colonisation?
Well, it allows for further criminalisation. The intergenerational trauma of violence is so complex and so layered. It's little things that are, being scared of the police. That can be traced back to, look, our great grandmothers hiding us from the Gungis when they come.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's one thing that, I grew up remembering. So my grandmother was a part of the stolen generations, and I was raised by my grandparents, and she'd always tell me, John, you have to have your uniform on, you have to look good. And that was, a lot of trauma that she's experienced in her life, that, if you are perceived to be an unfit parent, that, the state and welfare board will come and remove your children. So even now, that's passed on to me as well. And you can start to see how that does translate from one generation to another. And
it doesn't always translate in a positive way either. It can translate as fear, it can translate into destructive behaviour, like self-destructive behaviour, when things are internalised and not understood. But if we're talking about institutional violence, that is the nature and the purpose of institutions. I firmly believe that it's actually designed this way. The purposes for that are actually quite mundane, they're just economic. But the effects on us are genocidal in nature. Look, basically everything the institutions of government do fulfill the requirements of something being called genocide. There is violence waiting for us at every turn. You can't get on a train and come home from work after a few drinks with your workmates without possibly losing your life. You can't have an argument with your family or a family member or a neighbour without the police coming and you possibly losing your life. Mental health issues, you can possibly lose your life. It's and I hear the same things with Black Lives Matter, which is I think the George Floyd murder in America made other people, not just the usual suspects, but the wider community, open their eyes to the same thing that was actually happening here, and possibly seeing it for the first time. And I think it's great that defunding police and the abolition of prisons is finally being talked about in broader circles than it ever has been. I think we should ride that momentum, keep that momentum going.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really pivotal moment I found for myself over the last few months, and having to have uncomfortable conversations with my two sons. I have a son who's 6, just about to turn 7, and he's seeing stuff on the news and he's hearing stuff at school. So having conversations around, colonisation, how the police have always been an agent of colonisation to oppress Aboriginal people, and looking across the world, yes, saying that, amongst all these different communities, there's something that resonates with them as a part of the George Floyd movement, seeing Black Lives Matter and seeing what happened to that man and being able to empathise and find a synergy with that experience, and being able to relate it to the...
Well, particularly when you see it happening to our own people on TV screens here at home. Like the same techniques, the knee on the back of the neck, the pylons, the restraint chairs, the spit hoods, the handcuffing of children. It's like I think people thought that that just happened in America, but I think we're all starting to understand now that this is happening, and as has always been happening here.
Looking at it now, I think there's a large expectation placed on government to understand and acknowledge the role they played, but then also looking to the same people for remedies to address that intergenerational trauma. And I think as Aboriginal communities start to progress, they're understanding that Aboriginal communities are in the best position to incorporate ways of healing to address that trauma. And I know that's something that you're quite passionate about, working with other Aboriginal women that have that lived experience. How do you see is the best mechanism to address some of that trauma that we see with?
Well, nothing about us without us is the most important thing. And it's for them to actually come up with the remedies is ridiculous. It's the same as police investigating police. Everything, they're a hammer. They're an institution. Everything looks like a nail. You just have to bash it into a cell and all's good. So nothing is going to move through allowing them to reform a system that is beyond reform. I firmly believe it must be torn down completely and replaced with community-driven work in the areas that keep communities safe and keep people safe. I think we're best placed to do that, not somebody whose only tool in their toolbox is weapons.
And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had far more. I think too often the criminal justice system is the first respondents to a lot of complex social issues that we see within Aboriginal communities, whether it's mental health, drug and alcohol addiction, intergenerational trauma. Instead of coming up with Indigenous ways of healing, too often the police are the first people to become involved, and then it starts a very slow but steady decline into criminalisation, and then before you know it, you have.
Well, we know that if your parent or a parent has been incarcerated, it's more likely that you will be too as a child or as you grow. So the police play a pivotal role in our intergenerational trauma, and I think we have to remove them from that role. And that means more community involvement and engagement with people, not to stop them going to jail, because ideally we won't have jails, but to create the environments that keep them and everybody else safe, which is housing, education, employment or meaningful employment, and creating healing communities and healing places where the intergenerational trauma that we're already living with can be more sympathetically and more empathetically addressed and dealt with and healed.
Yeah, and that's something my grandfather, a real special cultural man who taught me a lot about my own culture and gave me stories and country. He talks about it a lot as well, and talks about traditionally before Europeans came to this country and implemented colonisation, we didn't have a prison system. We didn't have a mechanism to incarcerate people or to build fences to keep different mobs out. We were all united. We had our local forms of justice, and we had our local forms of healing and living in communities, but we didn't have that. And so it's a question about whether we start to reimagine pre-colonial life, and what are some principles and valuable lessons can we start to implement in the co-design of local justice programs as well.
I firmly believe that police, the institution of policing, is one of the most damaging, harmful things that exist in society, apart from prisons.
In Roach v. the Electoral Commission 2007, you achieved the ruling that incarcerated individuals constitutionally have the right to vote. Why is it important to afford prisoners the right to vote, particularly for First Nation individuals?
For us, particularly because we're the most we're the most impacted by that decision from the Howard government to strip us of the right to vote. For prisoners in general, it's disempowering to disenfranchise somebody of the right to vote, the most fundamental right of democracy there is. The argument was that we're undesirable. John Howard said that we were undesirable elements of society who are unlikely to vote anyway. Be that as it may, where they found it was unconstitutional was because this country has so many different jurisdictions. So sentencing was markedly different from state to state and territory. You could be have served 10 years for molesting children, probably longer, but you might have got out the day before voting, the day before going to the polls, and you would still have the right to vote. Yet somebody who is in jail for shoplifting would not be able to. Doing 6 months for shoplifting, for example. So that was clearly an injustice. It's not about undesirables. And of course, a lot of people are still in the community who've committed crimes. They haven't been convicted yet, or they're on bail. People can be out on bail for years at a time. It was just completely unfair. And the worst thing was the exclusion, I thought, to me personally. It was basically, that's it, you're finished, you no longer get to be part of this democracy. You're not included in this democracy, which is not fair because we are. We're still governed by the rules that are made by these people. And the thing is, you could get out, government can change while you're inside. People should be encouraged to participate. Being denied the right to vote, to me, was an exclusion from society. And I think people who are in jail and coming out of jail, the last thing they need is to feel further excluded. I think that's very damaging.
Absolutely. And you look at the First Nation population across Australia already. We are a minority within our own country. We're just north of 300,000 people. We still have a significant population of Aboriginal people who are incarcerated. So the minority that
highest in the world.
Exactly. So the minority that we already have, and we still have a significant portion that doesn't get the opportunity to participate in their democracy and have their voice advocated for. So, it's a significant impact on the Indigenous voice around Australia, and even more so when you have a significant population incarcerated and denied that opportunity. Given many First Nations people will come into contact with the criminal justice system as youth, and subsequently many will be incarcerated over their life, how does this experience exacerbate their criminality and represent a systematic failure in Australia's criminal justice system?
Well, as I say, I don't think it's a failure. I think it's working exactly how it's designed to work. Criminalising a child, it's immoral to make that child resentful, angry. You brutalise a kid in its most formative years, and you've damaged their psyche forever, and also institutionalised them to the belief that they deserve this treatment. It's like having an abusive partner being involved with the criminal justice system. You can't get away from them. They can do anything they want to you, and they make you believe that you deserve it. So it's really hard to detach yourself from an abusive partner who makes you believe you deserve it because, well, you think you deserve it. You accept whatever it gives to you, perhaps with anger and resentment, but you still accept it because you feel like you deserve it. And that's what the system has taught you. You know, if you behave the right way, we won't do this to you. But there's no right way to behave for us.
Prison abolition has many benefits, such as removing the potential for more Indigenous deaths in custody. What does society at large have to gain from decarceration and prison abolition? And how can some of those measures be implemented?
Well, yeah, what society has to gain is being much safer. And I know that will sound ridiculous to a lot of people. No, putting them in prison makes us safer, but it actually doesn't. Prison is a brutal place. You might be able to do programs and do weights and what have you, but for the most part, it is a brutal place. You being strip searched and actual physical violence from screws. The whole system is brutal. It's dehumanising, demeaning, and I don't think it makes people better.
Your advocacy work has focused on decarceration and prison abolition. What alternatives to arrest and incarceration might First Nation people be diverted to?
I think community-led programs, community-led healing programs, not as you're sentenced to this, but as community wrapping services around a person who's done something in the community that the community is not happy with. Housing services, mental health services, all these community services wrap around the person. Look, you can't get a job if you don't have somewhere to live. You know, it's all very simple, basic stuff. But going back to the intergenerational trauma, I think that's probably the most important thing we can do at the moment as an alternative to incarceration, because that's often a contributor to the reason why people are incarcerated in the first place. So I think dealing with that is probably the first thing we can do. But like I said, wraparound services so that people have got housing, they've got food, roof over their head, clothing, can look after their kids, all the basic human needs, which are not being met in the community for people who are in the community aren't incarcerated anyway. But we have to look at that in a holistic way, so that we're all cared for, we're all healed, and we aren't further brutalised through that system of incarceration and policing.
So this concludes our conversation with Aunty Vickie Roach this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Aunty Vickie, do you have any closing statements you'd like to make to our listeners today?
Well, thank you for talking to me, Jonathan. I think the most important thing is nothing about us without us. This all has to be community-led, led by us, and enabled by us. I think that's my closing thought.
No, thank you very much, and hopefully we've inspired the next generation to pick up and continue the conversation about decarceration and prison abolition.